Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Friedhoff. We are going to start our next chapter in evolution, which is going to be chapter 16, the evolution of populations. So in the last chapter, we focused on natural selection, and we talked about how Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands. Wallace saw the same things that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands, and they both kind of not co-published, but they talked about natural selection in their theory, in their publications. We're now going to look at how do species actually evolve? How do new species arise? What does natural selection look like in the long term? And just what further evolution can tell us about how we're all related. So, first of all, let's go over what evolution is. This is before we get to evolution, let's talk about what a population is. Populations are groups of individuals of the same species living in the same area at the same time. That should sound pretty reasonable. Again, same species, same area, same time. One thing to really note here is that populations evolve, not individual organisms. This is one of the biggest misconceptions students will have when going over evolution. They'll think, hey, one organism can evolve. They can change their trait for a particular environment. Now remember, that's what Lamarck thought. Lamarck thought that a single individual can evolve, can, change. Not going to happen. This is untrue. Populations evolve, not an individual. So over time, over certain generations, these populations will evolve, not a single organism. If you look at this graphic here, you can see the birds here. This is a population of whatever bird that we're looking at. You can have immigration in and birth rates or birthing. That's going to increase populations, but emigration and deaths are going to decrease that population. So again, populations, one species, one area, one time. Again, the big misconception here is that evolution is the change in an individual. This is not true. This does not happen like in Pokemon. What actually happens is the populations evolve over time. You can see here, this population over time will change. Thus, that is evolution. So again, individuals don't evolve, populations do. One thing that we want to talk about in this scenario is the understanding that a gene pool is all of the alleles of all of the individuals that make up a population. And I love using this graphic to show a gene pool because we can see all of these alleles from all of these wild pigs or wild boars. These are going to be the gene pools. You can see all of these big bees and little bees. These are the gene pool for that population. And we're going to look at how evolution is going to change that in the next section. But what I like to also show is, hey, look at this population. Each one of these circles is a individual, is an organism. What you see here are a bunch of letters that are the allele. So this is also kind of looking at the gene pool. Now, what is evolution? Evolution is any change in the allele or gene frequency of a population from one generation to the next. So if we look here, you can see all of these lighter beetles being killed off compared with the darker beetles. What happens is our allele frequency is going to change. You can see at the beginning, the large A has 30%. Let me go back here. The large A has 30%, while the small a has 70%, and that changes from one generation to the next. So that is evolution. It's not, something big or crazy. All evolution talks about is any change in that allele frequency from one population to the next. Hello, everyone. This is going to be the second section in Unit 6. We're going to go over speciation. So let's go over the topic of what a species is. This is a population whose members can mate and produce fertile offspring. So this is the concept that shows if two organisms can mate and produce fertile offspring, they are considered the same species. Obviously, like trees and cats aren't the same species. Dogs and I don't know, mice aren't the same species. They can't mate and produce fertile offspring. Now, this line or this concept isn't perfect because life in general is kind of just weird. Donkeys and horses are different species, but if you cross them, sometimes you get mules. But mules aren't fertile, so it's like there's kind of a gray area here. And when we look at how species change, so like I said before, concept has flaws. We can't tell, what species are or which organisms are which species in like the fossil record, or if they are the same species or not. So there are flaws with this concept. But one thing that we look at is something called speciation. This is where we form a new species through some type of selection. So in this case, you can see one species, then eventually they'll become two species. And this is just because of certain factors like natural, artificial selection, and just other things that are going on in that species. There are two main types of speciation. Our first is called allopatric speciation. This is where there's a geographical separation of a species. This leads to a speciation event. So you can see our original population here is cut in two. And then throughout time, these two different populations become different. So even if there isn't that geographical barrier, there is going to be two separate species here. We also have something called sympatric speciation. This is where a new species arise without a geographical barrier. You can see we have our original population and something within that population changes, and we can see speciation has occurred even though there's no geographical separation. The big concept I want you to understand from this topic is just a species becoming maybe two species because of some speciation event or some evolution. That is called speciation. All right, hello everyone. This is going to be the third section in chapter 16. This is where we're going to talk about something called genetic drift. This is where there's a more of a randomization or a different type of evolution in populations that we typically see. So up until this point, we've been looking at how how evolution has been for a reason. So something is being selected for, something is being selected against. But in this case, what we see is evolution can sometimes be random. In this example, genetic drift, this is where random events just kind of happen. You can see this person stepping on the green beetles. You might think this person is purposely stepping on their beetles, but just by random chance, they step on more green beetles than brown beetles. And that changes the allele frequency or changes the population over time. So this is evolution, even though it's random. And you might think, well, when does this happen? You can see this is a picture I found off of Twitter years ago. But you can see this boulder just smashed through this like forest of trees and took out a bunch of trees. So did this change the trees in their population? Well, yeah, of course. It definitely killed some trees off. Maybe one of those had a rare mutation that would have made it, more advantageous to have. But since this rock killed it, we're not going to see that mutation, that adaptation. And it wasn't for any selective advantage. If that rock would have moved a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, it would have changed again its path and killed different trees. So again, these things can just be random sometimes. So it's not all about selection. Sometimes it can be a little bit random. Any type of migration into and out of a population is also considered genetic drift, just because, again, it's kind of random a little bit because species or organisms might be moving into and out of a population just by chance. Sometimes there is some reason, but when we look at immigration, this is just gene flow. The bottleneck effect is when there's a disaster that usually kills a large portion of a population, and this lowers the genetic diversity in that population. You can see here what happens is this bottle with like these little circles in it. Imagine those circles as being organisms. If they're dumped into this bin, you can see by chance you're getting less variation in the next population. And we see this a lot in nature. When populations go through drastic reductions all of a sudden, what happens is their new population, the next generation, is going to have a lot less genetic diversity. And this is not good for a population. Our last example here is going to be the founder effect. This is where a few individuals, they establish a new colony, they colonize a new island, they just go somewhere different. And again, they're going to look a lot different than the original population. If you look here, we have a lot more diversity than our new founding area. This is because, again, a small portion is going to establish that colony or that the new area. And again, it lowers genetic diversity. All right, in chapter 16.4, we're going to cover something called micro versus macro evolution. This is basically a term that looks at the length of time evolution is occurring. So in microevolution, there are small changes. So micro meaning small, we look at small changes over populations, over several generations. Macroevolution is more large scale and it involves speciation. So what we just talked about with speciation, with species changing over long periods of time, this is macroevolution. Micro is small, while macro is large. And I actually don't even really like using these terms because evolution's evolution. It just looks at different time periods, but you might hear these terms later on in life, and just to understand them a little bit better, micro just means small, macro just means large. Something else we're going to cover in this section is something called sexual selection. This is a preference of one characteristic by a one sex an individual, whether it's male or female, for the other. So what this is based on is some physical attraction. There's something within, like you can see these peacocks here. they have a large tail that is attractive to the females of that species. They will select males with these larger plumes or these larger tails to have children with. So this is a type of natural selection that's called sexual selection. In our last section here on chapter 16, we're going to be looking at something called extinction. This is when a species completely dies off due to environmental factors. Things like obviously the dinosaurs have died off. Trilobites were a very common species millions of years ago, but during a mass extinction, they died off. Passenger pigeons are actually something that died off because of human interactions. But these extinction events and these extinctions occur at different rates. And when we see a large extinction event, we call it a mass extinction. This is again just a widespread, rapid decrease of biodiversity. You can see we've had several of these mass extinctions. There's been 5 in total. And this is where we've seen, again, a large portion of all life on Earth die off. And it's usually due to some environmental factors. For instance, the dinosaur extinction, or it's called the KPG extinction, this was caused by a meteor hit or a meteor asteroid hitting the Earth. And there were other factors, but that was one of the main factors. You can see we're actually kind of causing the next mass extinction. Now, it's not on anywhere close to the previous mass extinctions yet, but we are causing many species to go extinct just because of our interactions with the environment and the species. This is actually going to be the end of chapter 16.